Please unmute your audio. Very good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Ramanna madam, could you please unmute your audio so that we can check?
Yes, just 1 minute. Can I join it again?
Hello?
Can you? That's fine.
No, we can hear you, ma'am.
I've started.
Little louder.
Yeah. I've started the video.
Hello?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I've started the video.
Yeah, it's fine. We are able to see and also hear you.
I can see nothing.
Yes, yes ma'am. We can't check.
Yeah, now I can see everyone.
We will share the PPT when we start.
There's a very young person in the audience. Shiva Charan. Okay? Yeah.
Please do not raise hands or chat while the talk is going on. At the end, we will get all the queries answered. A request, please, Andhale 11, a hand is raised. Please remove that. Is Usha madam on? Has Usha madam joined the chat or Dr. Himanshu sir? Can we welcome madam and start the talk? Okay. On behalf of Ramniranjan Jhunjhunwala College, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Ramanna, my guide, and I would Dr. Himanshu Dauda, all the other co-participants, colleagues, friends, students. As head of the history, I welcome you all to introduce my PhD guide and mentor, Dr. Mridula Ramanna, with whom I have learned so much, and of course the process continues. Madam does not need much of an introduction among historians. She yes,
We can't hear you, Meher.
Unmute and check the audio.
No, it's mute. It's not muted.
can you hear me? Madam, you are unmuted now.
Yeah, and
Welcome.
DP has some issues.
Acha.
Now I think he's in.
Yes, ma'am.
Ramanna, madam, a
Hello.
very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Pleasure having you with us. And we are really very much indebted to you for having accepted our invitation. We also have our teacher today with us, Dr. Karmarkar. He's also joined today, sir. Good evening. And now I request Dr. Himanshu Davda to start the proceedings, please. Himanshu, sir.
Yes, madam. A very good afternoon to everyone in the room. Welcome you to the 12th lecture in RJ College Guest Lecture Series, initiated by our former principal and present director of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti, governing body of our college, Dr. Usha Mukundan, ably supported by our technical expert, Mr. Devi Prasad. And as a principal, I would like to put on record my sincere thanks to all the departments who slowly but steadily started joining the lecture series. And as we say, chale the akele, log milte gaye, karwa banta gaya. Today we are on the 12th day of this guest lecture series. We are also very fortunate to have with us our teacher, mentor, Dr. Karmakar sir. So welcome to the room. Thanks to all departments that during these 15 days, we could meet expert economists, scientists, doctors, yoga experts, and statisticians. Today, we have with us an historian as our guest speaker. Welcome, madam, to this session. Historians are like magicians. They take you back in times with their research and their passion for learning of the past. They many times bring us the wonders of the past and the whole thing as if enacted in front of us with their words and the facts fused together. I understand our historian today is going to take us 100 years back. Madam, in this lockdown period, when we are not able to meet each other, see each other, not only 100, we are ready to go with you 200, 300 years back. Welcome, madam, to this session. I request my head of history department, Dr. Meher Mistry, to introduce our guest speaker and also explain the format of our session. A humble request to every member in the room that if you have any question for the expert, kindly post it in the chat room. Dr. Meher will take a note of it, and at the end of the session, we will have a question answer where all the questions will be answered. This will ensure uninterrupted content delivery by our guest speaker. So over to Meher, madam.
Thank you for your inspiration, and to Dr. Usha Mukundan for providing us with this opportunity. I will reintroduce Madam because I think I was not heard before. I was not able to figure out who all had entered into the chat room. Dear current students, as head of the Department of History, I welcome you all to this 12th popular lecture series on of Junjunwala College. It is an honor to introduce my PhD guide and mentor, Dr. Mridula Ramanna, with whom I have so much, and the process continues. Madam is well known among us historians. She retired as head Department of History SIS College in 2008 after 34 years of teaching. She has several books and chapters in edited volume and is a much sought after authority on the history of medicine in colonial India. Her books include Healthcare in Bombay Presidency, 1896 to 1930, Western Medicine and Public Health in Colonial Bombay, and she's also written of founders and guardian of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. Forthcoming publication is also very interesting. It is titled Facets of Hello, can you hear me?
Now,
So, she and the dictionary of medical biography. She has published articles in several peer-reviewed journals, Journal of the Royal Asian Society, Royal Society of Medicine, Indian Historical Review, Economic and Political Weekly, Social Scientist, Indica, Journal of the University of Mumbai, K.R. Kama Oriental Institute, and several such publications. She has presented papers at several conferences and international conferences in Sri Lanka, Canada, South Africa, to name a
Hello, Mayor ma'am.
audio is not clear.
I think, ma'am, you can
Is my audio on?
switch off. I think you can switch off your video and then talk.
Connection is lost. Sorry.
I think we are not able to hear you. I think.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, now it's continuous, ma'am. Otherwise, it's breaking and we're not able to.
Oh, sorry. I think my connection is getting severe. Okay, can I continue? So she's received grants from the Wellcome Trust, Indian Council of Social Science Research, Indian Council of Historical Research, and presented papers at several conferences in India and abroad. She's delivered Ansari Memorial Lecture at Jamia Millia Islamia, the government fellowship lectures at K.R. Kama Oriental Institute. She has also been at University of Illinois. 4 students, including myself, have completed their PhD under her guidance. She has also had several MPhil students. Dr. Ramanna is much sought after by reputed publishers, Delhi, Oxford University Press, Orient Black Swan, etc. And several journals also send her manuscripts for peer review. As was featured in the BBC documentary Who Do You Think You Are by Bill Connolly, season 11, episode 9. I welcome ma'am to today's talk, and I request her to start with the talk. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I thank the college once again for giving us this opportunity to host madam's lecture. Thank you very much.
Can I start?
Yes,
Yes,
madam.
ma'am. DP, can you share her PPT on screen?
It's on the screen.
Achha.
Shall I start?
Yes, madam.
please, madam.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mistry, and thank you very much, Usha Mukund. I heard so much about you, but I had never met you. Now I have seen you on the screen. Next time I'm in Mumbai, we'll get together. I've retired and moved to Bangalore, and Meher wanted me to speak to you on this very important subject, which is today very much in the news. That is the influenza pandemic of 1918-19. I'll begin my talk now. The Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918-19 has been regarded the most devastating infection to strike the world since the Black Death of the mid-14th century. It has been dubbed the Spanish flu by the Spanish non-European press at the time. Spain was neutral during the First World War, and news reports were uncensored in Spain. So the other combatants suppressed news of the epidemic which had broken out in their ranks. Interestingly, it's also known as the Spanish lady. The literature on the pandemic is silent about why lady was used. Now, why a pandemic? What is the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic? A pandemic, because it begins in a single place and spreads throughout the world, resulting in very high mortality, more than 30 million deaths. Secondly, a virus subtype unrelated to previously known influenza viruses, and thus not a mutation of a known virus. I was invited to a conference at the University of Cape Town in 1998 when they were commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Spanish influenza pandemic. When I got the invitation, I didn't know whether there were documents in the Maharashtra State Archives, but fortunately I found them and I prepared this paper, and ultimately they brought it out as a book in 2003. But unfortunately, it is only a London publication. It's published by Routledge in London, and they've never brought out an Indian edition. Anyway, what was very fascinating about the conference was that there were people at the conference speaking about influenza in Spain, in France, in Britain, China, Japan, New Zealand, Sydney, the Canadian subarctic. The most interesting finding, as far as I was concerned, was this gentleman called Jeffrey Taubenberger. He belongs to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C., and he has done research on bodies which had been exhumed. These bodies were bodies of victims of the 1918 flu that had been buried in permafrost in an Inuit fishing village in Alaska. So they have done research on the bodies and they have found evidence of how to deal with it. But at that time, where my story will begin, they knew nothing about it. In fact, the place of origin was also much debated. It was suggested it was either North America or China. But the infection was first recognized in Kansas early in March 1918, and it spread around the world in 3 waves. The first wave was towards war-ravaged Europe, and then on to Asia and North Africa before reaching Australia in July. In the first wave, the mortality rate was low. The second wave was more lethal. It occurred in late August on both sides of the Atlantic, in fact, in 3 major ports: Fremantle, Brest in France, and Boston in the United States. In September, it reappeared as a third and more virulent wave in 1919 throughout Europe. And the virus spread along the conduits of war and commerce. Now, what did they do to to prevent the spread? They quarantined ports. The public transport was stopped. Passengers and luggage was fumigated. Public buildings were closed, like schools, cinemas, and so on, but not churches and bars. And they avoided congregation, that is, people mixing with each other, and they propagated the wearing of a mask. Some ads also urged the prophylactic value of tobacco and alcohol at the time. Now, I've just given this as a background, as an introduction, which I gathered from our conference. And at the end of the conference, they did say that what had occurred in 1918 is likely to happen again. On that note, we all departed. Now, as for India, what is striking about India, and you will see that in the next slide, can I have the next slide, please? This is the next slide. Can you see? Hello?
Yes, madam, we can see. We can see, madam.
Okay. Now, this is not India. This is a picture of the victims, or rather the patients in America. Now, what was striking was the absence of visual evidence. I will show you even later, the 2 slides that I have pictures are of the plague. In fact, there are many pictures of the plague which are available both at the Welcome Images website, on the Google Images, and so on. Now, India was exposed to a global epidemic, but this was also the time when the Great War had ended. The influenza episode is to be understood in terms of the local conditions. The impact of the disease was overshadowed by the prior encounter with the bubonic plague, with military recruitment for the war, the food shortages, price rise. India was pushed to the brink of famine. In fact, in 1890, there had been an epidemic of influenza in a relatively mild form. It had struck India and other countries in Eurasia, and it had lingered on for many years. But it didn't have any kind of major impact. Now, I mentioned that part of the reason for this absence of the visual evidence is the memory of plague. The plague, which 1896 plague, in fact, it had instigated a revolution in public health, because during the plague, the colonial state resorted to draconian measures, which included disinfection, inspection, fumigation, taking people out of their houses, separating families, and even the private intrusion of space, the intrusion into the human body because buboes were examined, and so on and so forth. It was a very interventionist approach, with the result that there was a furor of protest. And after that, I have noticed in my work that there was a change in the colonial policy, health policy. From 1905, this epidemic was 1896. From 1905, the public health policy undergoes a change, a slight change. And that change is they don't want to get too involved. They want to promote public health policy with the cooperation and support of the people. This is what they said. And at least in my research in Bombay City, they did attempt that. One of the effects of plague was the formation of the City Improvement Trust, both in Bombay and in Calcutta. But their whole policy was kind of ad hoc. Now and then they would get, involved, and at other times they would withdraw. So when the 1918 epidemic came, they are sort of hesitant to do anything, frankly. Then the other issue is, which is very interesting, unlike plague and before it cholera, both of them had erupted in the East, and they were regarded as a menace to the West. But the 1918 influenza came to India from the West. It was America and Europe's catastrophe before it was India's. And it was there in the West that investigative research and the quest for remedial measures were concentrated. Influenza was a viral disease whose causative agent was impossible to detect at the time, even under a microscope. It was not fully identified until 1933. Vaccines began in the 1930s and large-scale availability was only in 1945. Now, India's expertise in medical science, mainly the colonial scientists like Ronald Ross and others, had grown enormously since the 1890s, but mostly in parasitology and bacteriology, where the enemy was easier to identify and respond to, but not in virology. In India, as in the West, laboratory research was misled into believing that influenza had a bacteriological origin. An anti-influenza vaccine was prepared at the time in 3 of India's leading bacteriological laboratories, the Bombay Bacteriological Laboratory, which later became Haffkin Institute, the Institute at Kasoli, and King's Institute in Madras. And there were 3 scientists whose names I'll just mention: Glenn Liston, Soparkar, and Gore. These 3 were involved with the vaccine, but it was not very effective. Now, it is frequently argued that the influenza pandemic of 1918-19 was so destructive globally because it attacked some of the healthiest members of the population, whose immune systems went into fatal overdrive. But this does not appear to adequately explain what happened in India. In India too, in the second wave of the epidemic, it was adults in the 20 to 40 age group who were most affected. But there is a correlation between influenza on the one hand and poverty, deprivation, and debility on the other hand. The death tolls in India, 12 million or probably 17 to 18 million. There are differences in these figures, and they were certainly more than the military casualties in the war. Now, as far as Bombay is concerned, in fact, it first came to Bombay in June 1918, and this was on the 10th of June. 7 police sepoys, one of whom worked in the docks, was admitted to hospital with a non-malarial fever. The health officer, Turner, got alarmed and he traced the day-to-day progress. Between the 15th, when the workers of W&A Graham and Company, which was a shipping firm, were affected, and the 20th, employees of the Dockyard, Bombay Port Trust, HSBC, the Telegraph, Mint, Rachel, Sassoon Mills, they were all affected, and mortality increased suddenly, and there was mass absenteeism. Besides, Bombay in June, as the health Turner noted, is like a huge incubator with suitable media prepared for the insemination of germs of disease. Overcrowded city with a large working class population living in cramped conditions. So it lent itself to the rapid spread of disease. So from 92 on 21st June, mortality rose to 230 on 3rd July. The Times of India noted nearly every house in Bombay has some of its inmates down with fever, and every office is bewailing the absence of clerks. Now, when this spread, there were the usual differences of opinion among the colonial officials. Turner, the health officer, held that the crew of a ship that had docked in the port at the end of May had brought the fever. But the colonial government, as always, said that it is due to the unsanitary conditions of Bombay city. The sanitary commissioner, in fact, even made a declaration that influenza was endemic to India and little could be done to check its spread. But Turner, on the other hand, said, no, it has come from outside. And there were charges traded between Turner and the health officer of the Bombay port, about the latter's failure to report the cases. What is very interesting throughout this study, I found, was the press. They were very vigilant. Bombay Chronicle said the city and the whole of India has paid dearly for this neglect. The Times of India said it is the failure of the health department, despite the lakhs of rupees which are spent on it, for not having foreseen this. The municipal corporation saw concern expressed about the suppression of information about the disease among the personnel who came back on military vessels. Anyway, this June outbreak lasted 4 weeks. It took 1,600 lives. Turner said, it came like a thief at night. Its onset was rapid and insidious. The epidemic spread to other parts of Bombay Presidency and in July and August to northern India. The second more virulent wave, like I mentioned in the other parts of the world too, came in September 1918. And in the case of India, there was also the failure of the southwest monsoon, the subsequent crop failure, which led to a large number of migrants coming into the Bombay city. And it was soon apparent that the government didn't have the resources to cope with the epidemic. The second epidemic, in fact, there was difficulty in compiling statistics. One of the reasons being influenza was not among the heads under which mortality was recorded. The reporting agency, who should have reported the deaths, they were for the most part ignorant. And as I noted earlier, it was fatal among that same age group, between 10 and 40. Though earlier they had said influenza strikes very young or very old, but it was found that there was more fatalities among this age group, and also more women. And there was an increase in stillbirths, which was noted at this time. Now, in the second virulent wave, it was noted that Bombay had 219 deaths on 16th of September, rose to 768 on the 6th of October. Now, what did the government recommend? Can I have the next slide? What's happening? Can you see the next slide?
Yes, madam.
Okay, thank you. I can't see anybody, so the government's recommendations, is it that my video is off or what? I don't know. Anyway.
No, madam, we can see you and that slides as well.
Okay, good. Thank you. And in fact, I prefer to be in the dark. The government's recommendations to deal with the epidemic were, as this slide shows, isolation of the...
Madam, you have just turned off your video.
Madam, now your video is, now it's there. Thanks.
Opening up ill-ventilated buildings, encouraging the people to sleep in the open, and disinfection of the clothing of the infected persons. Now, as you can see, they didn't really know what to do. So they, gave these recommendations. The Surgeon General said, gargling with diluted potassium permanganate, aspirin, and warned against the use of quinine as a curative or prophylactic, and recommended immediate medical attention when the fever appeared, and finally, hospitalization. In the city of Bombay, they made accommodation for serious patients of influenza in the JJ Hospital, GT Hospital, Arthur Road Hospital, which is Kasturba Hospital today. And also they opened up well-ventilated school rooms. Now, the report of hospitals and dispensaries for the year 1918 records 220,000 cases under the head of influenza. Now, the rest were either treated by private practitioners or not at all. Now, the BMC, the Bombay Municipal Corporation, formed a medical subcommittee under the chairmanship of Rahmatullah Karim Boy, Dr. Kawasji Dadachandji, who is president of the Bombay Medical Union, Sir Kawasji Jahangir, and Dr. M.C. Jawle were members. They visited dispensaries and, very importantly, brought to the attention of the controller of prices the need to reduce the high costs of medicines. Letters were sent to what were called the large employers of labor, that is, the mill owners, suggesting the steps to be taken, because the majority of the people who were stricken were mill workers. Mill managers were called to the government to discuss preventive measures, and they put up posters in English, Marathi, and Gujarati advising the people to call for medical help or go to hospitals. They made arrangements for the distribution of milk and what were called pneumonia jackets. These were 2 pieces of cloth with an inch thick layer of cotton between, sewn like a quilt and fastened on the sides with tags. By way of affording additional facilities for the poor in the disposal of their dead, burning and burial fees were suspended at the municipal cemetery. The military authorities provided orderlies and ambulances for the removal of patients to hospitals. Now, the Surgeon General claimed that they had done everything in their power to combat the epidemic. But as I mentioned earlier, the press was very vigilant. They did not think so. Bombay Chronicle said officials have remained in the hills during the emergency. Young India said the government, which at other times claims to me our Ma Baap, now chose to throw them on the hands of Providence. Another paper called Gujarati said, what were the highly paid government experts doing to help people in their distress? The press even offered suggestions: construct huts in the open, provide better water supply. And there was pressure for on the government to stop the export of wheat, which was going out of the country. And that was done in the month of October. In the Bombay Legislative Council, 2 Indians, Purushottam Das Thakur Das and S.A. Upasani, raised the issue of the funding of relief measures. The government in its reply said that it had very limited funds. In other words, the government was throwing up its hands. Now, it is at this point that I found material about how the city of Bombay coped and some of the other cities of the presidency. Turner appealed to the people, to the public, and said that he wanted help to combat this, to cope with this. It's amazing to see the number of organizations which came forward to help in the coping with the epidemic. The Hindu Medical Association made house visits, directed those who had no one to nurse them to hospitals. Patients, as I said, were mainly poor mill workers. They were ill-fed. They lived in badly ventilated dark rooms with smoky atmosphere. It's interesting, they note that the people were initially uncommunicative. They were not willing to take treatment, and they had to be persuaded to avail of whatever treatment was available, which was provided by the Hindu Medical Association. 4,195 outpatients they treated. Now, the other body which responded to the appeal was the Social Service League. It was founded in 1911. I think the next slide refers to that. The social reformers were N.M. Joshi, Chandavarkar, Dr. Balchandra Krishna Bhatwadekar, B.N. Motiwala, and G.K. Parikh. They already had as their I'll mention this, what the Bombay Chronicle advertisements later, but the social
next slide.
Yeah, the Social Service League already had, yeah, this is a very fascinating map that I found in the archives, which maps all the places where there were relief measures available during the influenza epidemic in 1918. Anyway, to come back to the Social Service League, it already had the provision of medical relief and the promotion of sanitation and hygiene among its aims. The Social Service League was a body concerned with what I call the promotion of sanitary consciousness. It had conducted anti-tuberculosis campaigns and it had provided training in first aid. Please go back to the previous slide. Yeah. And now the Social Service League set up the Influenza Relief Committee comprising of industrialists, judges, and doctors, and it collected a fund. Now, it is interesting to see the contributions came from a variety of people and charities, the Vadias, Tata Sons, Richardson and Crudas, the Cotton Brokers Association, the Cotton Merchants and Mukaddams Association, individuals. There was rupees 500 donated by Parburam Popatram, who was a very well-known Vaid, to small sums given by anonymous donors. 20 centers were opened in different parts of the city to distribute a stock mixture, which was given to patients, milk and clothing. Arrangements were also made for the temporary boarding and lodging of patients discharged from hospitals. A special corps was arranged for the cremation of the dead. The work of the Social Service League was lauded by the Times of India. Another very fascinating feature of this Indian response is the setting up of temporary hospitals. This was done even during the plague. These were done on caste and community lines. The Jains were the first to open at Girgaon, the Lohanas at Mazgaon, the Marwadis at Kalba Devi, the Boras at Nal Bazar, the Patare Prabhus at Chopati, and for the Parsis, there were beds at the Parsi Fever Hospital and the Bomanji Petit Hospital at Kambala Hill. Then, to overcome objections from communities, nurse volunteers from St. John's Ambulance Brigade were organized into Hindu, Parsi, and Jewish volunteers. And there were a group of Parsi volunteers who formed the Parsi Emergency Corps, which included a Bataki Wala. He was a town crier. He would go around making announcements about dispensaries and arrange for an ambulance. 200 volunteers were provided by 25 organizations. These included community and caste associations, some of whom I mentioned, Dawoodi Boras, Ismaili Khojas, Lohanas, Bhatias, Patare Prabhus, Bandaris, Gaud Saraswat Brahmins, professional associations like St. George's Nursing Association, Students' Brotherhood, Students' Social Union, Young Men's Hindu Association, Mohammedan Association, Khoja Association, students of Wilson College, political groups like the Home Rule League, even bodies like the Temperance Association, the Matunga Residents Association, Telugu Free Library, Church Mission Society. It's fascinating to see the number of the number of organizations which responded to Turner's appeal. The treatment was provided by 12 doctors, and these were all voluntary efforts. 2 of these doctors were women. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the names. Now, in the meanwhile, the Indian Medical Gazette, which is the journal of the medical fraternity, received many letters to the editor recommending a variety of medicines, cures, belladonna, laudanum, camphor, a mixture of iodine and chloroform. And newspapers in the 1920s advertised T. Walker's elixir. This elixir, which was meant not only to cure pneumonia and influenza, but also to prevent it. Anyway, there were Ayurvedic preparations, which is on the PowerPoint. Bombay Chronicle carried advertisements for Shastric medicines developed by the world-renowned inventor of Amrit Dara. He was Kavi Vaidyabhushan Pandit Thakur Datta Sharma. Lakshmi Vilas Ras, it was meant to cure the debilitating after effects of influenza. And then there was Kalpataru Ayurvedic work which sold anti-influenza tablets. So some contemporary newspapers advocated Indian medicine. They said it's cheaper, it can be dispensed by schoolmasters, postmasters, and village officers. And so that's one interesting angle of this epidemic, which has to be borne in mind. The Western India Turf Club, that is what is today the race course, lent their premises as an office. The Japanese and Shanghai Peace Goods Association operated 2 relief stations. Blankets were provided by the mills. Cologne waters and tubes of menthol were given. So, to sum up, as Bombay was concerned, it looked as if the burden of providing relief to the public fell on the philanthropic sections of the public. This is, I'm quoting the newspaper, the Hindustan. The Sunday Chronicle said, everything has been left to the municipality and to local philanthropy. The paralyzing atmosphere of the Bombay Secretariat have kept the ma-baap of the people in a state of coma. So you can see they never spared the government in its in their indictment. Turner, on his part, paid credit to these organizations, and he acknowledged the support of officials like the vaccination superintendent and all the other subordinate health officials. Relief was also organized in other cities of the presidency on similar lines. In Pune, you had H.N. Apte, the president of the municipality, who supervised the opening of a temporary hospital. And under the leadership of Vittal Ramji Shinde, depressed classes mission provided relief, assisted by the Arogya Mandal and the Pune Volunteer Corps. At Sholapur, there were a few doctors and citizens who supplied free medicines. The municipal commissioner of Surat established 2 traveling dispensaries and an infectious diseases ward at the local civil hospital. And one Dr. Gajjar, who was actually associated with the founding of Alembic, he prepared a medicated mixture and he supplied it free to the municipality in Surat. And there too, you had the Parsi Orphanage, the Jain Hospital, Mitra Mandal, and so on, who did relief work. In Karachi, which was then a part of Bombay Presidency, aid came through a fund collected at the initiative of Jamshedji Mehta and 12 mobile dispensaries and bands of volunteers Free medical treatment was provided by Dr. Haji Ghulam Hussain Qasim, municipal councillor. The Citizens Influenza Committee, assisted by the Salvation Army, took up the task in Hyderabad, Sindh. Now in Ahmedabad, it's a very interesting study because the Gujarat Sabha, an association involved with social and political reform since 1884, set up the Influenza Relief Committee. And it seems that the municipality here was obstructionist to relief efforts. They refused the use of one of their school buildings as a hospital. And it was subsequently the donation of a building by Seth Jamnabai Bagubai, a businessman, which enabled the Gujarat Sabha to set up a hospital for the influenza patients. Now it's interesting to see that at that time, another paper in Ahmedabad called Prajabandhu had 6 editorials on the chronic insanitary condition of the city. And the paper pointed out that while the burden of taxation had been increasing, municipal expenditure had only been on the high salaries of the municipal commissioner, the engineer, and the health officer. We do not know what would have happened had the Gujarat Sabha not come to the rescue of the suffering poor. Here too, you had the St. John's Ambulance Division, the Salvation Army, students from the BJ Medical College, school teachers who volunteered their services. Funds came from the mill owners, including Ambalal Sarabhai, and associations like the Panchkua Mahajan, a body of cloth traders, Maskati Mahajan, comprising of cloth merchants, yarn merchants Mahajan, and so on. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, grandson of the Mahatma, has recently written about the Mahatma at the time of the Spanish flu. I suppose some of you may be aware that he lost his eldest daughter-in-law and grandson to influenza. Mahatma himself was unwell, and in this context, and as usual with the Mahatma, he had many ideas about his treatment. So the Prajabandhu commented that many differed from Gandhi about treatments, but Mr. Gandhi's life does not belong to him. It belongs to India. 13th October 1918. Gujarat Sabha also provided funds to the Salvation Army to reach the outskirts of Ahmedabad, Kaira, Panchmahals, and David Hardiman has worked on the Adivasis of South Gujarat, and he mentions the Patidar Yuvak Mandal, which distributed medicines there. Have I got 10 minutes?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Madam, more than that.
More than that, you may continue.
You have to give questions, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I'll try to finish by 4:30 because I want to make my concluding points, which are considerable. Now, what I have tried to show is the public involvement in dealing with influenza. My contention on the basis of the research that I did is that this public involvement doubtless reduced the casualties in the cities of the presidency. The Director General of the Indian Medical Service, Paddy Lucas was his name, he acknowledged that there were many shortcomings in the colonial public health policy and that it was not right to graft on India Western sanitary measures and systems without due regard to fundamental differences of Western and Eastern civilizations. Because sanitary reform, to be successful, required a knowledge of the people, a recognition of the diversity of local conditions in a country as vast as India, where there were numerous castes, communities, creeds, variety of climates, temperatures, and even levels of subsoil water. In the efforts of officials like Turner, there was an attempt to implement this policy regarding cooperation. My contention is that because of the way he reached out to the people, the public, and by the public, I mean, basically it would be the elite, but they came forward, they cooperated, and he too subscribed to the colonial assumption about epidemics being caused by the habits of the people. You know, this was very frequently a term which they used, the habits of the people. But he tried to reach for solutions at the ground level by liaising with Indian doctors, philanthropists, civic leaders, and established local bodies like the Social Service League. That is the first point of the concluding remarks. Second point is the public's readiness to contribute generously. This I found, because I've done research on the 19th century as well, was in keeping with the practice that had been started in the previous century, when several medical institutions were founded and funded by the public. Caste and community organizations and professional associations which were involved in this effort, in a sense, represented the cosmopolitan social composition of the urbs prima in Indis. You know, it's a reflection of the metropolis. It is significant that already a number of these voluntary organizations had healthcare and dissemination of knowledge about sanitation, the promotion of smallpox vaccination, the plague prophylactic among their aims. This is an indication of growing civic consciousness and of an understanding that health is as much a public responsibility as that of the state. It's not only the state, but the public too, which should be responsible. Turner paid compliment to all the workers in these organizations who had carried out these relief measures, and he declared that there is probably no house in the city that has not had a chance of relief. Now, after the epidemic, we will see that, the epidemic, the numbers from 3964 registered deaths due to influenza in Bombay City in 1918, the number fell to 1605 in 1920 and 118 in 1924. But deaths from respiratory diseases remained higher for longer. Now, after the epidemic, there were suggestions made. Indian doctors had met 5 times during the crisis, but they had no scope for independent research at that time. The voluntary organizations made suggestions that there should be more hospitals and dispensaries, more medical colleges, and very important, more nurses who should be trained. Private medical practitioners also made their suggestions. They said there should be drastic sanitary measures to purify the air and water. The government of India issued a memo in 1919 suggesting that in case there is another infection, schools, colleges, cinemas should be closed, disinfectant sprays should be used. The Bombay government was allowed to use the Epidemic Diseases Act and to prevent any further outbreaks. The Kesari at this time made the suggestion that if there is a future outbreak, use of hakims and vaids should be taken up. Now, to come back to the economic and political angle, you know, this epidemic, as I said, found scant expression in official documents, in public debate. The impact of the influenza epidemic was devastating As I mentioned earlier, 12 million and maybe even 18 million died. And Choksi, N.H. Choksi, who was medical superintendent of the Kasturba hospital even during the plague, he said influenza reached a virulence before which even plague with all its horrors fades into insignificance. Now, given this, why is it that there is so little about it? You know, there is, I don't know if any of you have heard of this book. There is a lady who has written on this Spanish flu. She's called Laura Spinney. She's a science journalist, and the name of her book is The Pale Rider. When she wrote that book, she wrote to me to ask if I had come across any images. No images. The visual absence is striking because when you see the images of the plague, there are so many scenes: hospitalizing the sick, cremating the dead, inoculating, and so on. Why not for 1918? There are a number of detailed reports, statistical compendia, commissions of inquiry for plague. Government plague proceedings run into dozens of volumes. There's nothing comparable for influenza. A preliminary report was published in 1919 by Norman White, the Government of India Sanitary Commission. But he published it before the full impact of the epidemic was known. And in India, you have accounts of cholera and plague, you know, enormous amount of volumes of material are available in the archives. Now, why was this was it ignored or what is it? It looks like the British state was chaotic, unknowing, uncaring about the mass mortality, and after decades of pestilence and famine, they were impervious to the sufferings of its subjects. In the light of 1918, when soldiers who returned from the war, they were actually implicated in the epidemic as having brought the disease, and they were the principal victims. Many of India's volunteer soldiers who went to the war came from agricultural families, particularly in the Punjab, where whole villages were wiped out, and the adult males proved vulnerable. In fact, there is a very cynical observation by officials that it's good that the epidemic did not strike sooner. Otherwise, recruitment into the forces would have been affected. Influenza perhaps received less public attention because for many Indians, the epidemic was not the primary issue. It was the symptom, not the underlying cause. Hunger, poverty, soaring prices were what really mattered. Harsh and worsening economic conditions aroused popular anger in ways which were not seen at the height of the plague years. In fact, influenza was a part of a more engrossing struggle for survival and subsistence. The Social Service Quarterly pointed out that no part of the country escaped, whether it was the hilltops of Simla or the modern cities or the isolated villages. And the Surgeon General did concede that mortality could have been reduced if immediate medical relief and nourishment had been provided. When you look at the effects, you know, especially of the economic effects, there were riots in Madras Presidency, docks, rail. I have focused mainly on Bombay, but in other parts of the country, docks, railways, trams, telegraph and postal services came to a standstill. Productivity in textile factories slumped as half the workforce lay sick and dying or fled. In Calcutta, the High Court was unable to function because judges, lawyers, jurors, they were all absent. Forestry Service, which was one of the India's largest and proudest state enterprises ground to a virtual halt. City cremation grounds could not cope with the number of dead. And anyway, there is, of course, the very famous reference to the poet Nirala, who recalled how he was summoned home with a telegram informing him that his wife was gravely ill with influenza. By the time he arrived at the village, his wife had died, and the Ganges was swollen with the bodies of the dead. He wrote, "This was the strangest time in my life. My family disappeared in the blink of an eye. Same happened to many laborers and sharecroppers." Now, the other strong sentiment which I would like to refer to at this time was in keeping with the political temper of the time. The press warned. It was not enough to call the epidemic a world scourge and sit with folded hands. A war had to be waged. In an editorial entitled Public Health in Young India, written in the aftermath of Jallianwala Bagh, they asked, does the government realize the startling psychological effects of the epidemic? The feeling in the streets of Bombay was that to a government which allowed 60 lakhs of people to die of influenza like rats without succor, it would not matter if a few died by shooting, that was at Jallianwala Bagh. This was an expression of the mood of the country. Thank you very much. I've taken exactly 1 month. Shall I? Can you go on to the, this is the temporary plague hospital and this is the infectious diseases hospital that's the Kasturba hospital. This is Choksi, who was the superintendent of the infectious diseases hospital. He was in charge till 1922. And this is the plague inoculation in Bombay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think we can have questions now.
Yeah, you
Please
have
post your questions in the chat box.
I think I've been half an hour you have, right?
Yes, madam, we have time.
Okay. I hope I didn't take too much time.
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am, it was very engrossing, and I think they have some very good questions for you.
Oh, thank you.
Meher, madam?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you please read the questions for madam?
Yes, ma'am, I'll do that. We have our first question by Janvi Shah.
Yes, and I'll talk.
Hello?
Yeah. Can you all type your questions in the chat box? It will be easier to then take them one by one. Hello, can you all just type your questions?
Yeah, they have started. Can I start with the questions?
Yes, Nehal, you can take over. Please come in.
Okay, yeah. So we have a first question. Why the archives were not used as a reference now? Maybe you could elaborate on the question. Ma'am, the question is why the archives are not used as a reference now?
For what? For COVID?
In the present pandemic.
In the present,
maybe.
maybe.
That's what
Yes, maybe.
Yeah, I get your point. What you mean is you can look back there. In fact, there are many similarities. I was hoping, I think Preeta had that question. You
Yes,
can see many similarities, which I did not pointedly remark upon, but there are many similarities. And I remember when the plague came to Surat in 1994, there were reporters who came running to the Bombay archive, Maharashtra State Archives, to look for the records of the plague of 1896. But the Surat one was pneumonic. Yes, you can get many pointers from the past. And that was the purpose of this conference, which was held in Cape Town.
Our next question is, I think by Nilambari Kulkarni, ma'am. What are the similarities in socio-political impact of a pandemic then and now? Are there any differences or similarities similar like this?
Yeah, I'm sure you can see when you look around, like what were now the Epidemic Diseases Act, which has been brought in, and the kind of, what is that, contact tracing, the system of surveillance which they used during the plague. As you may have gathered, um, the colonial response to influenza was not as draconian as it was to plague. According to historians who have looked at this, it could be that this colonial state was becoming more indifferent. They were not bothered. And they had just come out of the war. And the national movement was picking up. That's a very important angle to this whole thing, you know. So this uh, when you read about whether it is plague, I've been looking at my what I have written on plague, and I find that there are so many similarities. And then, interestingly, the editor of that volume in which my paper came, he is based in London, and I just received a mail from him yesterday that he is rewriting this from the point of view of the memory. Is there a memory of this epidemic? Of course, most of the people must be dead by now. But, is there a memory of this epidemic? And what do you learn from this, and what do you try to avoid? As you may have seen, there are many pictures on Google. Please look at it. You will see that the kind of prescriptions that were advocated at that time, like the wearing of masks and so on, similar to what has been prescribed now.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are the small things. Today, there is technology, which 100 years from 1918, actually, there is so many technological advances. But even so, you may have also noticed that these pandemics they spread through transport. Now you see, they are saying that it is globalization which has led to this rapid spread of COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our next question is by Dr. Meher Mistry. What are the parallels in government response in 1918 and now?
Frankly, I would not like to comment on now. I'm a historian. I'm not a public health expert. I can
Okay.
tell you how the
Oh,
colonial power behaved. The
oh,
national, yeah. So I would, in fact, there was a reporter who called me and asked. I said, look, I'm neither a doctor nor a public health expert.
right.
I have
Okay.
worked only in the Maharashtra State Archives and British Library and the Wellcome Institute.
Right. Our next question is by Professor Varsha Moye. Were there any incidents of discontent among people due to lack of daily supplies?
Yes, there were. In fact, I referred, there were riots in Madras Presidency.
Okay, so they were due to lack of supplies.
And also, as I kept emphasizing, the economic angle, for them, this was one more. I mean, how many trials and tribulations the Indians had gone through. This was one more, one more struggle for survival and subsistence. And as I said, there were, what is this, price rise, and wheat was being exported. So that was only stopped in October. And as I mentioned earlier, also the municipal committee went and met the controller of prices to, control the prices of medicines and food. So it's but one thing is there, the full demographic toll from the epidemic only became apparent when the decennial census of 1921 was published in 23. Till then, they didn't know how many people had died.
Oh.
By then, India has moved into what? Non-cooperation, civil disobedience, the leadership of the charismatic Mahatma.
Yes.
So the very survival of the Raj was being threatened by them. So you see, it's a, yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I would suggest to the audience, who I assume are many of them are historians, they should try to fill in this void in the historiography of the pandemic and look for accounts in poetry, in literature,
Right.
in music, this question about the protest.
Right. Our next question is: were there interstate migration back then during the pandemic?
You mean like what's happening now?
Yes, right, like now.
Actually, as I mentioned earlier, there had been the failure of the southwest monsoon, and many migrants did come into the city. So that is why the toll was higher. But it was not like you had in the plague. During the plague, people just fled Bombay. Bombay's population became half.
Yeah.
They were so frightened. And though Choksi says that the virulence was much more, apparent with influenza, but the death from plague was so much more horrific. So that is probably, but one doesn't read so much about the migrants. Yeah.
Okay, I missed out on this one. Did anything like a mask culture begin at that time? And if it did, how long did it go on?
What is mass culture?
The one like the putting on the mask, going on
Yeah,
about putting on the mask. Yeah.
with India, I don't know. But when you look, as I said, there are no visual images. Though that was a recommendation. That recommendation was made, but there is no reference to that as such. The thing that they recommended, including the newspapers, Times of India, in fact, had a recommendation which they said gargle frequently, use this potassium permanganate, and they recommended fresh air. In contrast to what we are now seeing, of asking us to be inside, they said go out. And that is why they wanted those huts to be put up in the fresh air outside.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, they said when there is fever, go immediately and get medical attention.
Yes.
And it's interesting that this morning, I don't know if you noticed, but Trump says he's taking, what is it called? Hydrochloroquine. But the Surgeon General at that time warned against the use of quinine as a curative or a prophylactic.
Okay. This is a question related to the 1896 plague. Is it true that Hindus opposed disinfection drives and even vaccination during the plague?
You can't make a generalized statement on this because you have very ambivalent responses. Some objected, some did not. And that is where the role of these civic leaders is very important, and doctors. They played a role. They were among those who took the prophylactic and then propagated it. And my research has shown that their role was very important. And so were leaders like Tilak and Gokhale and Devdar in Pune. They all said it is for your good that you should take the prophylactic. There were objectors from all communities, even among the Muslims, even though you had the Khojas and Aga Khan being one of the first to take the prophylactic, there were some who objected. And then I don't know whether I mentioned it in the Vazay College lecture. The smallpox vaccination, they would do arm to arm vaccination.
Yes.
And at that time, they would object to the vaccinifer community. The child is a Hindu. He had to get it only from a Hindu child.
Right.
And so on. But as time went on, these things, it was not arm to arm. That's
Okay.
calf vaccination.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Next question is how did the influenza affect rural areas, and did health measures reach out to the villagers, and also did it affect the agricultural sector?
It did. In fact, as I said, in Punjab, the whole villages were wiped out. And with the British, public health organization never reached the rural areas. Rural areas were beyond their radar. They were mainly concerned with the cities, and especially cities of commercial importance like Bombay, because that's why they were very keen on this Epidemic Diseases Act, because they wanted to, because of the commerce. See, otherwise other places might put the quarantine against commerce coming from Bombay. So that they are only concerned with the metropolis. They are not concerned with. That is why Kesari advocated use Hakims and Veds, use schoolmasters, postmasters, and others to dispense, uh, relief. But the rural was just beyond and the number of sharecroppers and laborers who died. Unfortunately, there has been little work on regional studies of the influenza pandemic. Apart from my work on Bombay, there is another scholar who has worked on Mysore state, which was a princely state. He has worked on Bangalore city as well. And that's a subject which many people could take up. The Punjab and so many areas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is what was the role of women physicians and female medical education in British India during epidemics like these?
Oh, they were very important. As I said, there are references to two women doctors. I don't have their names, unfortunately. But during the plague, we have the names of these women who were, Manek Tarkad was one, and Cecilia de Monte was the other. And there was a lady called Annie Walk who succumbed to plague. Then there are references to nurses who succumb to plague. Just like you are seeing today, what are the frontline workers having to put up with? You had that during the plague. Here during the influenza, I came across one young volunteer who died during the influenza. And the records mention him, that he worked very hard volunteering, but he succumbed to it. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is were the marginalized affected worstly as now during the influenza?
Yes. Because as I said earlier, there was crop failure, there was failure of the monsoon, there was famine, So definitely they were affected. And also these soldiers who came back, what about them? So many of them, of course, came with the disease, and some of them became victims of the
Yes.
disease. So, yes, definitely. But you know what is important, I feel, about this pandemic is the pandemic, as far as India is concerned, is to look at it from the perspective of the local conditions. You know? Yeah, that's what I feel.
Yeah. Um, okay. Our next question is, how did people cope with influenza and started to have a normal time? And how did that go?
You know, by normal time, you mean going out. Yeah, well, things slowly improved. And then, as on my last point, I mentioned that just in the heat of the uh, epidemic, you had Jallianwala Bagh and you had all the, the national movement
Mm.
picking up. So Indians were preoccupied with other things. And of course, there was always that burden of poverty and economic hardships which they had to bear.
So
So,
epidemics and pandemics were like one of those always coming and going.
correct, correct. And there is
Yes.
a kind of fatalism that
Mm.
we have seen decades of this, and this is one more
One more of them.
long
Yes.
story, you know.
Yes. Yes.
That is probably why you don't have much expression in private correspondence. But unlike with the plague,
Mm.
you know, and I don't know whether some of you are aware, but with plague and with smallpox and cholera, there were disease deities associated with the
Yes.
disease. With influenza, it was like another fever. And as I said, when the statistics were collated, they didn't even know what is this. So
Mm.
there was no head for influenza in the
Death toll
yeah,
count.
yeah. So they
Yes.
didn't know respiratory disease, pneumonia, what is it,
Mm. Maybe that will be connected to our next question. Did any divine punishment theory prevail with respect to epidemics?
Yes.
Mm.
But that was a fatalism. That was fatalism. You found that in the plague. And then they did say that this will pass. Maybe we deserve this. That
Mm.
fatalistic attitude was there.
Mm.
Was there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, ma'am, you mentioned many of those newspapers. There's a question regarding vernacular press. What was the reaction of vernacular press against British policy during pandemics?
Yeah. This source which I have accessed
Mm.
is something very, very precious.
Mm.
It is the report of native newspapers, including vernacular,
Mm.
which were collated by the government.
Mhm.
Many of those papers you won't find today, you know.
Mm.
What they would do is they would collect every week, extracts from various newspapers, and they are available. I mean,
Huh.
that is such a rich source to gauge what was the response to all these measures. That's why
Right.
I was able to tell you about how they reacted. All the press, I was very impressed by the way they had something to say about the way they went away to the hills, they are not bothered, that
Mm.
kind of, very freely they are talking about it. Young India, you have thrown us in the hands of Providence and so
Mm.
on. And then
Mhm.
the last quote I thought was very poignant, that you have left us to die like rats without succor. This is young India.
Mhm. Right. There's a question on would you suggest any literature discussing psychological impact of the epidemic on collective consciousness and
So,
any permanent health policy measures adopted during 1920s?
uh, I'm sure since most of the audience must be historians, Dayaki came in
Hmm.
after this, and health was an issue which could be taken up by the Indian ministers, but their hands were tied by the lack of funds. Funding was always an issue, but I have done a study of the Legislative Council proceedings during Dayaki, and I have found that there were many questions raised on public health policies, you know. And as you know, later that led to the Boer Committee report and so on. So yes, public health does come into the public arena, both at the legislative level, with the press, and as I mentioned, the realization, especially when you study the voluntary effort, that public health is as much a public responsibility as it is the responsibility of the state. You know, people themselves should be careful, should obey whatever regulations, etc.
Right.
That's my theory. I don't know.
Yes. We have, I think, one more question.
You have 7 minutes more.
Yeah, we have time, ma'am. The role of local self-government, was the role of local self-government satisfactory during the epidemic?
Well, you know, this is the transition period, no? Dayaki comes in, and it is just that period of transition. But I gave you the example of the municipal corporation.
Hmm.
Bombay versus Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad, Praja Bandhu complained that Ahmedabad municipality is not doing anything about public health. And while here in Bombay, the municipal corporation did form this committee and took an interest and was very involved in the effort to provide relief. Yes, that is there. But later, as I said, when you read the Legislative Council proceedings, you see that there are a lot of issues which are raised because of local self-government. People are able to, you know, and to, since you asked this question, if I may digress, in the late 19th century, when 1882 ripens local self-government, I'm sure you remember.
Yes.
At that time, Mandlik, he pointed out that the government, by you, I mean the colonial government, is trampling upon our rights of local self-government. So there was an attempt to try and assert, you know, their voice, and you find that response in Mandlik to the way the colonial government was trying to impose its will.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I think.
Thank you, madam. I think that was the last question. I request Arvind Ganachari sir, who's also present among the participants, if you would like to comment. Devi Prasad, if you could mute Arvind Ganachari sir. DP? Hello?
I do not know. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. If you could comment.
There cannot be anybody better than Mridula talking about this subject.
Your voice is not.
It's a wonderful this one. But I really think that if one is to compare it with the present things, I would like to ask one question to her. How much correspondence do you find between Bombay government and the Indian government? Huh? Because most of these people, what you called as hills, staying in the hills was at Shimla. More than Delhi, they stayed at Shimla. And that's why people kept complaining that they stayed in the hills. But how much you find that they left it totally to the totally to be looked after by the Bombay government, or did any central government or imperial government had any role in it?
Not too much, because they would like to wash their hands off. They did allow the Bombay provincial government to bring the ED Act, Epidemic Diseases Act. And that was done, as I said, mainly to, because they wanted to notify pneumonia. They wanted to declare pneumonia as a notified disease under the Indian Ports Act. But by and large, they are indifferent. And as my study has shown, I feel that it is people like Turner who, who kind of played a role of liaising between the voluntary organizations, and I don't see any other counterpart in other cities, but I don't know. It's interesting, but at that time they had just come back. You've done so much work on the war.
Yeah. So you have in your book on Bombay presidency,
Right.
have one full section on hygiene consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, how far was this hygiene consciousness was there after the influenza, and how much? Why was it lost? That state is an initiative, and what is the need of that hygiene consciousness to be inculcated in the people today? So it doesn't come all of a sudden. So it needs to be on a long-term basis. And somebody just now said that, and you also mentioned that some people went to the archives to find out. I think what needs to be there is a coordination between academics, policymakers, both at the center and the state. And what you all have written, Mridula, is something that policymakers must take note of it. What was done earlier, so that, and this is an instructive to them. And there should be a coordination with all. Everything what you or David Arnold or anybody has written cannot be just lie in the libraries or in the things. It needs to be brought to the notice of the policymakers. They can't just run on an ad hoc basis. I think what my question to you is, why was this help in a sanitary consciousness lost in the later time?
You're right. In fact, it is such a unique thing that in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you had this sanitary consciousness through various organizations which were set up at that time. I wonder whether it was because of this kind of collaboration between the public and the private, and you had the public represented by Turner and the private by doctors, by philanthropists, and so you had that coming together, and you have many of the activities in the early 20th century in Bombay, like the Bombay Anti-Tuberculosis League, the League for Combating Venereal Disease, and then for infant and maternal welfare, and so on. And you're right. What happens to them? What happened to Bombay Sanitary Association in later years? You do find a few reports, but I think it kind of,
my suggestion would be to take your point ahead, is that it should form a part of this curriculum at the school level.
Yes.
It should form a part of the school level. And I suppose there was something like this when somewhere in the 60s when I was in the school. I do remember to have had. But why was it this is something should be inculcated while we were children. And that needs to be, so health consciousness, sanitary consciousness, and it needs to be inculcated. And this should be brought not as whether it is as a state subject, because it has always been a state subject even under diarchy, and always without funds, because it remained in the hands of the Indians, and all resort subjects had monetary fundings. So it always suffered. Now at least I think there should be coordination it should be one at the long-term basis and one at the short-term basis. What we should do in the short term, but in a long term, I think we should put it in the syllabus right from, say, maybe third standard or fourth standard, and right through we should have also practicals in that. So something of this kind needs to be, it should be done. That is what my suggestion, it would be my suggestion.
No, and you are right. This was done in the early 20th century.
Rightly,
Bhatwadekar,
you have
others
pointed
did
it out. Yeah, yeah,
mandatory instruction
yeah.
in schools, very important. And
Uh,
now,
after, yeah, after I spoke to you once, I found a book by Bhatodekar, Professor Dr. Bhatodekar, which he wrote that book on sanitary health conditions and
right.
was sent to Florence of Nightingale. I found it in the Date Suchi. Maybe after the lockdown, I may have a look at it and send it to you. But this is something that needs to be put on a firm basis, not as it comes, as what people, we say governments are always treated. And whether healthcare people, is it being treated in a different way is different. And healthcare policy and consciousness is at a communitarian basis.
Right.
So both at the communitarian basis, at the state policy, and as at the school level, and as at those health workers who are working their conditions. So everything should be looked in a very holistic way, I suppose. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir, for your comments. I request Dr. Usha Mukundan, Madam, and Principal Sir Himanshu, sir, to make a few comments, and then we can propose the vote of thanks. It was a wonderful lecture, ma'am.
Thank you very much, madam. It was a pleasure listening to you. And I think history teaches us quite a few things. And you very rightly mentioned that sanitation was one important agenda at that time. But I feel today also it continues to be the agenda. Somewhere we really forget things, even though history is meant to be remembered, and we have to learn lessons and not repeat the same mistake. The wonderful narration that you gave, and it took us back to that Spanish flu era, and I think we also will be a part of history. Having seen this, I only wish that we learn lessons from what we are experiencing today. But one very important thing, a wonderful teacher that you are, and a very good researcher. This is a combination which is a wonderful combination. And we could see that passion when you were narrating. You went back, and literally I could feel that when you were writing the book or when you were going through the archives, the immense excitement that you had and the research work which you projected. I think it's a lesson for all of us that research has to be a very integral part for any teacher. And that is why today, the moment you talk about this pandemic, your name stands tall. And we are very fortunate to have your student as my colleague, Dr. Meher. And I'm very sure she will keep your legacy very alive. We seek your blessings on this occasion. And please stay safe, stay healthy. You are a great inspiration for each one of us. And thank you very much. Over to Dr. Himanshu, my colleague.
Thank you, Usha.
Yes. Thank you, madam. It was wonderful lecture indeed. As madam rightly said, Usha madam, a wonderful teacher can do wonders with students around or with the students are not around. Thank you so much, madam. It was very enlightening. We are botany teachers, but the subject of history was so wonderfully put to us. Thank you, madam. Thanks on behalf of every member of RJ family and people in the room. I also thank Arvind sir for the wonderful discussion that you had with our guests at the end, and it was so enlightening for all of us. Thank you, everybody.
Karmakar sir, thank you very much for being with us in all the sessions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, both of you, for inviting me. I enjoyed.
Our pleasure indeed,
Thank you,
madam.
madam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, madam. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
I request Snehal to now propose the vote of thanks before we wind up. Snehal, please come in.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. On behalf of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti's Ramniranjan Jhunjhunwala College, I sincerely thank Dr. Mridula Ramanna for giving this overview of Spanish influenza in Bombay. Your research, ma'am, has thrown light on several things like the reformers' role, individual communities' role in relief work. It was heartening to know the role of volunteers for combating the pandemic in the city, and from time and again I and all others also have come to know the importance of newspapers as an important source of historical research through your talk, ma'am. And thank you for suggesting avenues for research in the field of medical history also through your talk. You know, this talk has reiterated the fact that we have to go back to history to not only draw parallels but also to most importantly learn from it. So thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the enthusiasm with which you answered all the questions. Thank you to all the participants for making this a very fruitful session. Thank you, Ganachari sir and Karmarkar sir, for gracing this session also. And I thank our director, Dr. Usha Mukundan, principal, Dr. Imanshu Davda, for their support and encouragement. And I also thank Devi Prasad Shetty for all the technical support and cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Good
Thank you.
evening. All of you have a good evening.
You too, ma'am. Please
Thank
take
you,
care.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, with the permission of the guest speaker, we end today's session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Stay
Thank you.
safe.
Good night.
Stay
Thank you, sir.
smiling.
Thank you, sir.
80%.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Leave meeting.